Yeah.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Matthew Mickey here, and welcome to Life Without the Rose-Colored Glasses podcast. And the purpose of this podcast is to talk to some of the more established individuals within their profession to see how they manage stress and adversities and how they balance a healthy lifestyle to get to where they are currently, right? And we want to understand their outliers that happened in their lives that gave them the competencies that led them to success, right? We want to see the stresses. We want to see like how they manage that stress because they did something right that got them to where they are now, right? So this podcast is brought to you by Dialect.app. Dialect is a conversational machine learning AI platform that can take any data set and you ask it a question, it'll pull up the response. And it's managed by my good friend Tony, who was a paralyzed Marine, and like he started that company on him by himself, and like now he uses it for options data, and like is working on macro data. And so check out Dialect.app, and if you guys like it, talk to Tony. Tell him Mickey sent you. I don't get paid by Tony. I don't do any of that, but like Tony's my buddy, and why not endorse his company? All right, so moving on. So my name is Matthew Mickey. I'm a retired disabled Army vet, and usually Tony, the paralyzed Marine, would be on here with me, but he's feeling under the weather right now. Now let's talk about who we're bringing on the podcast today, right? And how I got to know him, right? So we'll bring in Kris, and if you don't mind saying your last name, because I'm going to jack it all up.
it's a Kris Abdelmessih.
There you go. Right. And so I was in my car one day, and like I followed this guy on Twitter forever because I was trying to learn volatility and in the options arena, and I came across one of those tweets that was like, if you want to learn volatility, here are the top 10 people on FinTwit. And he was like number 2, and his good buddy was number 1. And so I followed him, and then next thing you know, 5 hours later, I'm still reading all of the stuff on his Twitter, right? And so that led to me saying, like, this guy's worth his salt. I don't know how he knows this much stuff, but like his mooncast, like every week, write-ups are like magnificent. Like they covered math, they covered volatility, and they covered options, and then they covered real life situations. And like that's how I got to know you, man. I fell in love with your writing, and then I heard this crazy podcast a couple of weeks ago. Well, it's probably been a couple months now, where he was on it, and it was the first one I've ever seen him on. And trust me, I Googled you to see if you were on any other podcasts. And, like he was sitting there talking about being a market maker for 20 something years and not knowing how to invest. And I said, that's transparency and that's humbleness that I value right there. And so I reached out to him, asked him to do this podcast with me because, like here, the whole purpose of this podcast is to help veterans transition in from the military to the civilian sector, but to help anybody, right? Because we all deal with stresses, and there's no level of defined stress. It's up to the individual, right? So what Kris might have stressed out about when he was 20, I probably could have cared less about when I was 20, and vice versa, And so we want to talk about you today, Kris. We want to learn the outliers in your life, and why don't you tell us about yourself?
Awesome. Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Matthew, for having me on. Matthew, I love what you're doing, man. You're total inspiration. I love what you're building here, just helping people to ultimately make better decisions and, just have more agency over their life. A huge fan of it. So let me just say that right off the bat.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. About me. Sort of let's see, I was I basically had a pretty normal existence growing up. Went fairly middle class kind of life. Grew up with my parents moved here from Egypt, from Cairo. I was born here in Brooklyn, and basically my parents were really big on I kind of had one giant advantage in life, which was that my mom was really into really emphasized education. That was everything to her. She was a taskmaster and knew that in this foreign land, that was going to be my ticket to having a good life, was to get educated. So education was a big emphasis for me, and I did well in school. I was pushed pretty hard because I was probably pretty prone to like not necessarily focusing, but she really, that was kind of like this great thing that she did for me, which was to help keep me focused and help keep me on the right track. And then uh, did well in high school and college and stuff, but didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life exactly until around junior year of college. I started to learn about investing a little bit. By senior year of college, I had actually decided I wanted to become a trader. And I had worked, and my mom had worked at a bank, and I had spent some time at the bank as an intern, basically opening mail and doing bringing traders lunches and stuff. And I was pretty enamored of traders because I'd go in there trade. First of all, they would get free lunch, which to me at that time in my life, I thought that was the coolest thing. Kind of a small imagination, but that's where I was. So I would go into the trading room, and these traders would have they would have all these screens up, and they would have all these opinions about everything. And I felt that they were so knowledgeable. And I liked the idea of this sense that they could look at the world like a big spider web. And if you tugged on one part of the web, it's almost like they were trying to predict like what would happen on the other side of the web. And that was what I thought that's what I thought trading kind of was. So I thought that was kind of fascinating, decided that I wanted to become a trader. And then senior year of college was kind of just bouncing around a career fair, and this firm had a little booth set up with dice and cards, and they were inviting us to come like play some games with them. That didn't feel like work. It felt, and I found out that they traded options. So I ended up interviewing with them. I did terribly in the interview. There was a bunch of math questions, and I did not do very well on those questions. But I think I asked a question in that interview, which was, looking back, probably one of the most, like a watershed moment for me, which was I just asked the interviewer, I said, I realized I don't feel like I did very well here, but I like this stuff, and how do I learn more? And he gave me the title of a book to read. And when I went and read that book, and then I guess the fact that I asked that question gave him the confidence to invite me back for another interview. And in that second interview, I nailed all the questions because I read that book, and the answers came straight out of that book. So the book was called Getting the Best of It by David Sklansky, which the first chapter of that book I recommend to every trader to read because it gets into the concept of edge. Anyway, that moment, I ended up being able to get the job, and then I started on Wall Street on the floor of the American Stock Exchange when I was 22 years old, and then I proceeded to trade options pretty much for the next 21 years. I spent 12 years on the various floors in New York. I had a membership on almost every floor in New York: the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, the NYMEX, the COMEX, the NYBOT, which is now the ICE. I had memberships on all those floors. When I was over and doing commodity options, I started in equity options, and then I went to commodity options around 2005. And I would just go to whatever floor had a lot of action. I started in oil for the most part, but later on, as the years progressed, I basically traded everything that was in that building. And then in 2012, that was 12 years into my career, 2012, I got a job at a hedge fund in California running a volatility, relative value volatility strategy focused on commodities. I did that for 9 years, and that takes me up until last year. I left the business a year ago. I'm just kind of hanging out a bit with my kids now, and thinking about the next chapter for me. But in this period of time, I've taken to trying to help people learn. I've always had an interest in education. I was always involved in education in my professional life. I trained lots of people in my professional life, and now I'm just trying to see how I can help people that are trying to learn, at least about options. That's what I really
Yeah,
know.
I mean, it sounds like with options, like you probably forgetting more about options than most people will ever know about options. And what I'll tell you is like that's another reason why that's the second part of my YouTube is like whatever I learn has to go on video. I have TBI from 8 different concussions, like 6 from my ADs, 1 from airborne jump, and 1 from getting hit by a car here in New York City. And that way, people don't have to pay thousands of dollars from the scammers to learn options or anything, right? Education is a powerful thing, especially when you're investing your hard earned money. And I know I've spent thousands of dollars on courses that were not up to standard and that the people teaching them had a conflict of interest. But what I'll pull out of your story, right? Everybody has outliers, right? So what I've realized is like your younger years, being from like childhood to like your 24, 25, those tend to be your second and third standard deviations in life, right? Those, but however, they push you into the 68th percentile of your life, right? And so that's how I view life. And I know that's a weird comparison, but you're a stats guy, so you can kind of understand. It sounds like your mother was an outlier in your life, right?
She's a
Like,
warrior. I mean, my mother is a warrior. Like, I could go on and on about describing her, but she's a very, very tough lady, and did not have a simple life. And
yeah.
she imparted a lot of that into my sister and I.
That's good because like I'm a father of an 11-year-old, and you know my background. I grew up homeless. I grew up in the foster care system, and then I joined the army. So like I would never compare my life to your mother's because we had 2 different ones. However, when it comes to raising my daughter, and I'm a sucker for girls, right? I live in a house full of women, and like they can walk all over me all day long, right? So like, why don't you explain, at least so I can learn, like what your mother did that really shaped you, and like was she just completely tough on you all the time, or how did she show empathy, love, and all that?
Yeah, there's
I know that was
yeah,
that was off the
there's
ball part, like
there are
off
two
script.
ways. There was two ways. She was strict. She was very strict, which helped keep me on track. Now I have to say that one of the things I do believe is that every kid needs to get individual treatment. She was strict with me. She was not strict with my sister because she was wise enough to know what we each needed. My sister was extremely self-motivated. She was, like a valedictorian type, and was her own standards were very high for herself, and she didn't need my mom to be strict with her. As a matter of fact, she completely refused my mother's help at every stage. I, on the other hand, was a little bit more, I wasn't a bad kid, but I was a bit more distracted. I was very concerned with fitting in. I felt, you know, I can remember going to school and, like I said, I'm Egyptian, and I would, you know, third grade, fourth grade, I would open up my lunch and it would be like a pita bread sandwich with like some cheese in there or something. And all the other kids were like, the hell are you eating? And you would just get heat for that because you were different. And I'd
And
go home.
now they pay a lot of money to eat that food.
It's true. But back then it was foreign to everybody. And I I would go back home and be like, Mom, please stop at the pita bread. I mean, I'm just trying to fit in and you're making my life harder. And I was very, very, very self-conscious. I was very it's not that I was timid. I was just always felt like an outsider trying to fit in. And I wasn't that secure in myself. And she was able to give me what I needed. Her big thing was probably the biggest lesson I got from her was to not care about what other people thought. She really had to drill that home with me because that's what I needed. So yes, she was very strict, but we have a great relationship even to this day. She had always made it feel like I can come to her and tell her anything. The lines of communication were always open. So she somehow was able to balance. There's this touch where she could be strict and hard, but loving and vulnerable and open to communication all the time. She really, really wanted us to confide in her. And in order to do that, you have to make it so that if your child tells you something that they probably wouldn't if they feared punishment, that you have to be reasonable about how you deal with it afterwards. It's not like, I mean, honestly, if I did something bad, she might have to punish me, but she still had to make it so that I would tell her in the first place what I did. And I just think she navigated that with a very beautiful touch. It's something I aspire to with my own kids. I think I'm too soft with my kids. Yeah, I have a softer life than my mother had, and
Yeah.
I'm softer with them. So I don't, but I'm trying to figure out how to have that balance. I think I have a good balance with like communication with my kids, but I'm probably too soft on them.
Yeah, and that's something I struggle with. But Denise, my wife, she's very, very much like your mother when it comes to that. I remember Lily one time, told us she was like in the third grade or the second grade, and she told us that she was being bullied on the bus. So I go to the bus and I'm like, "Hey, bus driver, like some of the older kids are bullying her. Can you like move seats?" And it was right before Halloween, right? And the day of Halloween, I'm walking her to school and she's like, "Dad, I lied. I just wanted my own seat and next to the window." And like I was furious because like I talked to that kid's family that was bullying her, and like we came up with a plan of action and that kid got in trouble. And I remember thinking like, just get on the bus and we'll deal with this when we get home. And I go home and I talk to Denise about it, and she's like, "All right, she came out and told you the truth." And even though how radical that might seem, and that we're raising a psychopathic, second grader, like we still have to reward that. And so we came up with the consequence that she wasn't going to go trick or treating. And we were all dressing up as Charlotte's Web that year because like she was real big into reading the book and watching the videos. And so like I was dressed as the pig and she was dressed as a spider. And I forget what my wife was a spider web or something. And so the consequence was, like, you're not going trick or treating, but what you can do is you can dress up in your costume and hand out candy. And, like, even to this day, Lily remembers that and she still confides in us. Even when she does wrong, she knows that, yeah, she'll probably get in trouble, because it's all about the intent. And then like kids are going to be dishonest, kids are going to do shady stuff, kids are going to be undisciplined and lackadaisical. It's about like, did she recognize it, what are the steps that she's doing, and what was the intent behind it? And that's how my wife thinks about punishment, where I'm like, I'm the outliers, the positive and the negative outliers. Like I'm the guy who would like throw everything out of her room, make her move out of the house, clean her room, and then move everything back in. But then I would be too soft in this situation. So like I think there's a lot of the communication piece in a relationship. Like I don't know how much you and your wife talk, but like you guys definitely have different strengths in talent management, like strengths and weaknesses. So like I don't know, do you find like your wife being the strength where you are weak in all that?
I think that's definitely true. For example, I'm more, I think she's actually pretty good at being stricter with them. Um, but at the same time, I'm more of the one that's letting them, like I'm the one who'll let them do dangerous stuff more than she will, because she's, we kind of have this debate about whether the 8-year-old can walk to school by himself. And I'm all for him doing it because I think it's important for him. And she wants to helicopter, and it's not like she doesn't understand that if you helicopter, you will, you can't put these kids in cocoons because then they're not going to learn. She
Yeah.
understands that intellectually, she gets that. But we had a crossing guard die in our town this year, getting got hit by a car. There's always we've had a biker recently get hit by a car, and like I know that those are rare things to happen, but it does not really matter when it's emotionally that is your thinking about if that happened to your child. And even when you walk with your kid, you see them do dumb things like, hey, the ball gets too close to the road and they go and they grab it. But there's some, you have to let go a little bit and we can debate about what that age is.
Yeah.
And we watch this show, I forget the name of it, but it's like these kids in Japan that are going out and doing all these crazy things.
Like 3-year-olds going to the grocery store and stuff.
Totally.
Yeah, I know.
And I know this isn't Japan, and we're not in some rural town and all that, but there, you have to find the right balance for these things. So I find that I'm more okay with the kids doing stuff that she would consider as risky. And we go back and forth on this. I understand where she's coming from. She understands where I'm coming from. And we just kind of meet.
That's pretty awesome. And I definitely agree with, like, when I was 13, like, I was able to use public transit, like I'd drive to 7-Eleven, get a Slurpee, and come back all by myself, and but that was a different era back in the 80s and in the 90s, but like at the same time, like now that I have a daughter, we definitely deal with it as well, because like you don't want to give their confidence an imbalance, like you want them to be confident, you want them to be independent, because at the end of the day, you're not raising a kid, you're raising an adult, right? With everything you do. And that's been my philosophy on a lot of things when it came to Lily, is like, what can I do to make her think like an adult? Like, and obviously you have to balance that out and be, level that out with some common sense. But like everything that I train her or do with her has to be thought of from an adult mindset of her maturity level. So I definitely value this conversation, and like, I'm glad I'm not the only one that deals with this.
Yeah, to that point, I always say the big tension in parenting, every parent feels the tension. It's, you are trying on one hand to preserve their innocence, and on the other hand, you're trying to prepare them for a harsh world. And we just have to balance that. I mean, both of these things are true at the same time, and we're just trying to make our best. You point the ship in the right direction and hope it gets there.
Yeah, and like the kid thing, like that's my favorite thing to do, is watch my kid play outside as a kid. Like every day for hours, she'll go outside and play with all the other kids in the neighborhood. And like when it comes to the adult stuff, that comes naturally. Like that finds a way to incorporate itself into my child's life. And next thing you know, we're having like serious conversations I never thought I would have with the 11-year-old. So kind of moving on though, because like this will tie into the next question, like in the Army, it's really important for leaders to conduct talent management on their soldiers. And the reason is so they can understand in detail their soldiers' attributes and competencies. And that way you can learn to lead them, and develop them and kind of mentor them into being the best they can be for your unit, right? And you understand their strengths and weaknesses, and you understand who you compare them up with to like help their weaknesses and for them to build that confidence from their strengths. Like I used to do it all the time. Like I would take a soldier who was from the city, who was very, very confident in, different dimension thinking about the third and fourth order effects, but kind of sucked at being a problem solver and a reactor and an executor, right? I'd always pair them up, and it was typically with the country boy who was a good problem solver, reactor, and executor. I'd always pair those two up and make them do tasks together, and they would like thrive off of their strengths. And you could see clear as day, like the weaknesses come out on both sides, and the other one, after a couple of weeks, they would build that camaraderie with each other because they were a team. And you could see like them starting to like pick up the trend. So you got the country boy who's thinking about the third and fourth order effects, where he's used to thinking like, let's just fix the problem, let's react, let's execute. Then you got the inner city guy thinking like, okay, it's time to go execute. So with you, like, I've never seen this in the civilian world, that much. Like, how important was self-reflection, and how important is it within the family or just within yourself, and who do you justify, like who do you use kind of as a mentor for your own strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, this is I think it's a great question, just because I think that the answer is, you all alluded to it, it comes from other people. You cannot there's this you're probably familiar with like behavioral psychology stuff that's kind of popular, like Danny Kahneman stuff, where we'll talk about things like loss aversion and hindsight bias and all these kinds of like different cognitive biases that we have. And there is a if you look at his if he would even admit that Danny Kahneman would admit that if you know about these cognitive biases, it really doesn't help. You still have them. And the only context in which they have largely found that we can inoculate ourselves from cognitive bias is other people. It's from communication. It's by having a culture or a network where you can discuss things in a way that invites other people to criticize without you taking it personally or negatively, to take it in the way that all of us are on the same team and trying to get better. We all care about getting better, and so we cannot get better if we cannot call each other out, or you have to do this with the proper touch, but there's no reason you don't have to be mean or yell or anything like that, but you can speak in a constructive way to each other to try to unlock what was going through a person's mind when they were making a decision. So I think that the answer is to seek feedback and to give other people feedback and to do it in a constructive, open way and make it okay. It's okay to be wrong. What's not okay is to be wrong and be stubborn against trying to get better. What's not okay is to be unteachable.
Yeah, I definitely value that comment, right? Because the Army forces you from day one to do that. And they call them after action reviews and counselings. And, every month, like I would have to give my soldiers a counseling on their performance, the good, the bad, the ugly, the awesome, after every operation, if I move trucks from the motor pool to the gas to go get fuel, like we have to do an after action review, like, all right, did we plan this right? Did we take the right roads? And there's a lot of value in that. And that's why I'm kind of the way I am right now, where like you could tell me, anything, you could criticize me about anything that I do, and I'll be like very open-minded about it. And that's definitely from experience. Like that's something that you can't just read in a book. You have to actually live that. Yeah, I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, I think the other thing is if we just think about portfolio theory, you're you're trying to find complementary things that fit together. That's also true with your team. I'm in the world that I lived in, I was below average at math compared to my peers. I would if so I might be good at coming up with a new idea, and then I might need to lean on other people that were better at math to sanity check me or to actually study it. So there might be some basic amount of study that I could do, but there might be, for example, statistics is like, when I look at statistics, it's a very complicated field. I don't really, even with a regression, I'm not exact, like I can interpret a basic regression, but the assumptions that go into regressions themselves are, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that go into that. And I have to be humble enough to say, hey, I'm not just going to believe my interpretation here. Let me give this to a stats PhD and say, hey, what could I be missing? What am I not understanding? And that's okay. You have to have a system where people feel like they're not being judged for lacking knowledge. As a matter of fact, your team is best off if everybody is as complementary as possible and everybody has different strengths. So whether some people are better, that's just at the whole organization level. The fund isn't going to work if your salespeople can't communicate well to the clients. If your ops people need to be good at ops, they don't need to be good at doing calculus. So everybody has a role, and you want to give everybody a chance in that role to excel as far as they can and not judge people for what their deficiencies are. Yes, we'd all like to raise our deficiencies, but I think you go a lot further by leaning into your strengths and then constructing the portfolio of people thinking about the strengths and trying to just, if Steph Curry is guarding somebody, it's like, well, he's, one of the best offensive players in history, but on defense against some guys, he's going to be a liability. Well, they're going to have to hide him in some ways. It's the same thing in a business. Like, you might have to hide some people's weaknesses in some ways. Like, I'm not going to have the quant might not be the right person to go out speaking to a client, right? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it's okay to lean into your strengths first and not worry about the weaknesses as much. And then it's the organization's problem about how to mix everybody together.
Yeah, and like the thing about that is like being humble enough to admit your weaknesses, and be okay with your weaknesses. Because like in my profession, everybody tries to be the best at everything and train, like, like at the end of the day, like for me, I sucked at land navigation, right? As a young soldier, I was the worst at land navigation, right? And one day I just told my team leader, I said, Sarge, like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing at land nav. I keep failing my land navigation tests and blah, blah, blah. And he was like, I got you. He said, this Friday night, you're not going to the bars. You're not doing what you do for fun. You're going to come out in the woods with me, which is a really creepy thing to tell another man, like, am I going to get murdered? I'm just kidding. But like, and then the whole weekend, he sat down and he said, listen, land nav's one of my strengths. I grew up walking in the woods and doing all this stuff. And he's like, you're overthinking it. He's like, listen, I'm not telling you to do anything hard. I'm telling you to go from point A to point B and then come back to point A. That's all you're going to do. And he gave me a plot. I got my map and my compass, and I jacked it up and came back and was like, I don't know what point B is, and he was like, all right, let's try this again. And we just did that until I was decent at it. And I did get decent at it, but like I had it, like, for me to improve like that. And I never was trying to be like the senior navigator or anything like that on the ground. Like, I always, even to this day, like and I remember like I got promoted under very, very harsh conditions. Like, the squad leader died or got killed and then I got promoted. I was the next guy up, right? And I had to navigate in Iraq for the first time in an urban city in combat, and that scared me to death. And I had to be transparent and be like, I went to my wingman and was like, listen, like, I know I'm supposed to be the guy up front leading us, but like, will you just have your map up and make sure I'm going the right way and I don't look like a jackass? And he did, and like that, like, helped me beyond belief, right? So being humble enough to say that you're weak at something, like, there's a lot of respect behind that. There's a lot of honor behind that as well. But then there's also, with what you said, there's a lot, like, you don't build winning teams identifying your weaknesses and admitting your weaknesses. You build winning teams identifying and holding on to your strengths, right? And I definitely agree with that. So with life as it is now, right? It seems like the VIX is always above 30, being that we're always doing job, we're always working, we're always a father, we're always a husband, we're always a brother, we're always a son, like, we're always a friend, and we have all this stuff pulling at us, what are some things that you do to maintain a healthy balance, healthy balanced mindset, and not lose control of your anxiety with all this? How do you decompress and keep that healthy mental status, and how important is that in your life?
Yeah,
And how was it important when you were on Wall Street managing millions of contracts a day?
Yeah, this is a great question. You've you kind of, I had to think about this. You kind of prompted me before we went live here about this question, and because I realized I had never really consciously thought about it, but I was quite deliberate about what I did. I just never thought about it before. And then I love this question because it forced me to think about what I was doing that was deliberate but unconscious. I think I've divided this into two things. There is the managing stress and keeping sane while doing this job. is partly logical and partly emotional. And I'll go into each of those. First of all, the stress of the job is completely unavoidable. You cannot control the fact that you're going to have bad runs. It's inevitable. You can control how you deal with it. So let me look at the logical part of this first. So the first thing to being logical and staying sane when you're having a bad run is to recognize that there's base rates. You have to have some sense of whether the outcomes you are experiencing, how expected were they in the first place. I mean, I'll give you an example. Like if I'm getting, let's say you're getting 4-1 on 4-1 odds on a trade that pays you off 1/3 of the time. You do a trade like that, you definitely have edge. You do that trade in the long run, you're going to come out ahead. But the lived experience of actually doing a trade like that is you still lose twice as often as you win. You only win 1/3 of the time. So you really need to be aware of the variance of the bet that you're making, and that losing is actually quite normal as far as the frequency. So your batting average is going to be kind of low. Your slugging average is going to be much higher, but you cannot lose sight of that while you're in the middle of a losing run, because hey, losing runs happen. So it's actually the same thing as like a poker player. A poker player knows if they get dealt a pair of aces and they're in a 5-person game, that they might have edge, but they're still going to lose a high percentage of the time, even starting with those aces. So you just have to the logical part is understanding the base rate of the trades that you're in, and that losing might be completely normal.
And what I'll tell you on that, and even if we apply that to trading versus real life, the younger individual that's an ego hit for the younger individual. And when I was 20 to 24, 23, right? Anytime I lost, I would completely scrap that plan. Even if I won it 9 times before, if I lost it one time, screw that. I'm changing everything. I'm trying a new approach, so you have to be cognitive, not to, really understand what works. And you have to be cognizant of the probabilities of loss,
Totally. I totally agree. Moving to the emotional part of this, there's a few things here. The first is just perspective. Let's be honest. I would rather have a bad day at work than find out that one of my kids is sick, right? So bad P&L is stressful. Like real life stuff, like your kid being sick or your wife not feeling well or something like that actually stresses me out way more than anything that can happen at work. So I think perspective is about, I don't know if this is a great thing to do, but this is what I do. I think a lot about people that have things worse. I look at people that have major disabilities and that can persevere. And I look and say, like, if they can do that, if they can run a mile, with they've lost half their leg and they're running a mile. I have no excuse. And a bad P&L day, it's just bad P&L. I mean, think about what the odds that other people are climbing all the time. So I think it's just centering to think a lot about people that have a worse situation than you. This is, my wife would almost smack me because I'm always doing this. It just works for me as far as creating gratitude and lowering the stakes of whatever I think is just so bad in my life.
I love that. I used to tell my soldiers all the time before something crazy, we had to go do something crazy. I'd always be like, listen, remember, most of the situations we're in, somebody dumber than us, less physical than us, and the odds completely stacked against them, had to do the same thing, and they've done it thousands of times before us, right? And then the second thing is, I would always compare our missions where we have these nice, comfortable boots, and we have these awesome weapons. We have all this bougie, Call of Duty equipment, right? I'd always be like, listen, This is hard, yeah, but imagine being in World War One or two, where some of those soldiers were in, like, the coldest environments with some like no socks and some crappy shoes on. The weapon was heavier than anything, and like they haven't eaten in forever, and they're just like embracing their suck, right? If they could go forth in those kind of conditions and accomplish what they did back then, you know, we got this, like we just, and a lot of it goes for the soldier, it goes into the rehearsals of the variables, like not only should you, everybody says a good plan goes to shit once the first bullet flies, and I've always like countered that, well, that just means you didn't, like you focused on the operational part, you didn't focus on the analyzing the variable parts, right? Because like that was my big thing, is like everybody will focus on like the execution, right? Not many people analyze the variables and like how you're going to react to every variable out there. And like, so when I plan operations and stuff like that, I analyzed it so detailed that I knew what the weather was and how the enemy responded to the weather, and how it's going to affect their equipment, and and that way at 2 o'clock in the morning when we're hitting the ground and the enemy comes at us with the kitchen sink and the water still running, they weren't going to throw anything at me that I have not already thought through. And that controls a lot of the emotion and the psychology behind it, and that allows you to control that adrenaline. And like, and then if you get your team to rehearse those variables, then it's just a synchronized ballet, and the enemy has no probability of winning against you. And the same thing applies with anything in life.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the idea, these other ideas of how to stay kind of to deal with stress, there's basic hygiene things you can do, like just have other places in your life where you can pick up a win. I mean, you're not just a trader, you're a partner, you're a parent, you're a son or a daughter, you're a friend. I mean, you have other outlets in your life. You can have a bad day at the office and you can have a good one in the gym, or you could have a good guitar lesson, or there are other places in your day where you can pick up wins that will offset the fact that you lost money. I mean, you
Wow,
can't.
I got a lot out of that sentence right there. I've never in a million years would have thought that way.
Yeah, I think for me, it was very, very important to have outlets, because if you focus on just one thing, if everything to you becomes this narrow, your whole self-worth is coming from this one thing, you are super fragile. So I think what you have to do is recognize that the wins that you get in other areas of your life, they're just as important as what you're doing 9 to 5. If they might not give you a P&L report card every day. As a matter of fact, the fact that they don't give you a P&L report card every day lulls you into thinking that maybe like you don't manage those things. It's like there's that expression that not everything that can be measured gets is necessarily important. I forget how the expression goes, and everything that you can measure, that they're not necessarily all important. So It's the same thing. It's like your relationship with your spouse, when you go home, you don't get a report card for that, but there are wins and losses that are happening in as far as like being a good communicator with them when you go home. And so you can do a good job in other ways besides just generating P&L on any given day. So I think it's not constructive to let your P&L be to keep bringing that home. One of the stories here, I watched this documentary about the Manning brothers, about the three Manning brothers. And the thing that struck me about it was Archie Manning had played for the Saints, and I think he didn't even have one winning season. His entire career was basically a failure. And the boys, his son said that when he came home, you had no idea if he won or lost. He never brought it home. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm just a trader. This guy was a quarterback in the National Football League. His job is way more important than my job is. And this guy does not feel any need to bring that home.
And there's a lot more oversight on him than there are like me and you. Like
totally.
Millions of people were watching him. Like, wow.
Yeah. I mean, he's got all kinds of pressure on him. He has public scrutiny. He's got public scrutiny probably on his family, and yet he never brings his work home with him. And I'm like, so who the hell am I to bring my P&L home with me? If Archie Manning doesn't want to isn't bringing his wins and losses home with him. The other thing I think about too is part of my own thinking about dealing with stress has actually just come from a good role model. The CIO of the fund that I worked at, he was always upbeat. You could never tell if he was winning or losing. He had a quiet confidence about him that I really aspired to. And it really, that confidence came from understanding that process will triumph over the short-term outcomes eventually. So in my mind, he embodied what it looked like to be a pro, to act like you've been here before. Um, I never wanted to imagine if you whined or threw your keyboard because of your P&L or something like that, and your kids saw you. I mean, is that who you want to be? And I think about that a lot. Like, that CIO was a role model to me in how to act like a pro and be a pro. And when I think about that, if it impacted me and I aspired to be that way, then everything, and that's just a relationship between me and my boss. Who do I want my kids to see? Do I want my kids to see somebody that whines and moans about something like P&L? Absolutely not. So I just think a lot about the way I conduct myself is a way that I want. I'm just very conscious about being somebody that somebody else is looking up to. And if that's my kid, mostly my kids, of course.
Yeah, and that's respectable right there, because like we might be living it in the now, right? However, we're building a legacy that our grandchildren will be impacted by how we act with our kids in the room, right? So if you think of it, like a generation has three impacts, right? For us as men, you're going to have your father, the son, and the grandfather, right? And the grandfather impacted how the father raises his son, right? Your legacy will ultimately come down to your grandchild, right? Because how your son raises their children will be based off of how you raise them, whether it's you gave him a lot of negative qualities, and he learned what not to do, or you set the example for him, and when he's a father, he's gonna remember that. I remember, like, I agree with you, those leaders and the mentors that I respected the most were always upbeat, not like the annoyingly happy person, but they always had a positive like thought process towards the situation. They always knew when I was thinking there was no way out. They always knew how to like be like, Mickey, take your blinders off and see it all. See the bigger picture. Like, this is just a mere drop in the bucket, right? And like that speaks volumes. And I lost my train of thought of where I was going to go with it. So I think we're going to move on to the next question.
No problem.
So, like, as we kind of discussed in previous conversations, like nobody cares about you like old Sarge on the battlefield, right? And like when I was a leader in the Army, like this always stuck out to me, right? I had a good leader tell me, he's like, whatever decision you make, it could be the right or the wrong one. You made a decision. And as long as you saw that decision through and you knew how to like adjust those variables and it had the right intent, like you're going to be fine. Right. And, I came up with this kind of concept to like factor in the 21-year-old soldier, who was deployed in an austere environment. He had a heavy ruck on his back. He had a substance abuse problem, anger issues, and just wanted to grind so he could eventually be a leader in the Army, right? Back home, he had a wife who just like moved a location away from her family, and she was pregnant with a stack of bills. Whatever decision I made had to like directly impact that soldier and his family, right? When to lay the hammer down on him so he could like get his attention, when to like be empathetic on him, when to give him a study plan, like it all comes down to like leading your men or women, in the right direction, right? based off of their qualities, right? What recommendations and advice do you have for the thousands of traders who are like that young soldier that look highly upon you for guidance? You know, your writings and newsletters are kind of how you lead right now. How do you lead the young trader like I had to lead the young soldier?
Yeah, I think I think the first thing there is to be, at least in the trading context, we'll start with the trading context, but being honest about whether trading even makes sense for your circumstances. I mean, that's like really the first thing. You have to get better at anything, you have to identify like your weakest links and your obstructions to improving. And if you're starting out to trade, you're not going to be setting yourself up success if it doesn't even make sense for you to go down that path in the first place. So, for example, I think it's very difficult to trade if your survival depends on it. So when you're starting out, you should keep a full-time job. And if you're going to try to learn the trade, you can't do it as a full-time job because you can't let you can't let a game that has a lot of randomness in it, a lot of noise in it, be the source of your income if your income is if this is just like how you're going to survive. So I think you need to get to a safer cushion before you can decide to get into that game full time. I think that
Always tell those people, and not to cut you off, but I always tell them like you need to redefine your goals and your purpose of trading, because like you don't trade for income. Like I didn't take my first trade 2 years after studying. Like I studied this crap for 2 years before I was confident enough to place my first trade. And then when I like realized I still didn't know enough, I stopped trading, right? And but the one rule I've always had is I'm not allowed to apply more risk if I'm not good at it, right? Because my thought process in trading is compounding interest, right? Like if I'm trading for income, which I would love to just trade for a living, right? If I'm compounding, I mean, if I'm trading for income, I'm never really going to grow. And that defeats the purpose of, me trading. But I didn't mean to cut you off, but I definitely agree with what you're saying.
yeah, I mean, and I think you can, I think the framework for even thinking about that problem is just pretty much can be couched in the like the math of the problem. I mean, it's a bankroll versus edge thing. If your edge is tiny, you need to make many bets and you have to risk small amounts on each one. And if you can't find enough opportunities, the business of trading isn't really going to work for you. You'll be tempted to increase your bet size, and eventually that will lead to ruin. So then you need to go find bigger edges, but that's hard, and that's going to require a lot of time and effort and R&D to find larger edges. And those larger edges, by the way, those are the kinds of edges that have half-lives. They don't last forever. So the point is there's a lot of idle time in learning to trade. There's a lot of idle time where there's going to be no income coming in and all that's going out is effort and expenses. So I think that the very first thing for guiding other people is even establishing if this makes sense and for them to even try. And really, for it to make sense, it requires that you cannot rely on the income. And if you don't rely on the income, that means you probably have another full-time job, which means that the amount of energy you have to devote to this is not going to be that high. Very difficult to do if you have a lot of obligations in your life. So I just think that going into it, if you want to set yourself up for success, you just have to go in with your eyes wide open about what you are willing to endure to get better.
And can I give an example of that? Because like you just hit the nail on the head for most retail traders, right? So for example, right, everybody tells you you're going to fail as a retail trader. Everybody tells you like, like the expectations of a retail trader are way more than I think people understand, right? Because you got hedge funds and you got funds out there that have teams designed for every single aspect that are analyzing this as a full-time job. And you as a retail trader, you're just trying to figure out what an RSI does and how you're going to find your edge in that. Like, that's ridiculous, right? And so for me, like, I remember, especially when I first started, and I still do it to this day, every day, every single day of my life for about 10 years now, I've had to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and from 3 to 5, I'm studying order flow from the London Exchange, or I'm studying something, or I'm like back testing my theories. And then usually from like 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock, I'm doing the same thing. And that's been every day for 10 years. And, if you're not willing to put the commitment to learn this stuff and continue stepping outside of your comfort zone, like just like give your money to people who are trained and who do this for a full-time job. It's not worth retail traders. Like the reason I got into this was because we would deploy to various locations, and as an infantry guy, you don't spend your money. There's nothing to spend your money on when you're in Afghanistan, in like the valleys of Afghanistan. So like my soldiers come back with these big savings accounts, and $5,000, $10,000, and I'd always tell them, like, invest, pay off your debt, but don't blow it on stupid stuff. And the 1% of soldiers who did invest, they would listen to CNBC, do the pump and stuff, pump and dump stock of the day, and they'd blow up their accounts. And that got me furious, and that got me learning this. And because I knew the blood, sweat, and tears that went into that dollar that they just threw away, right? And I learned real fast, quick, and in a hurry that the reason they lost it was they didn't take it as a profession. So unless you're willing to like take it as a profession and like allocate the correct amount of time and to set achievable goals, like you just stop right now, and that's with anything in life.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's an analogy here that one of the things I think is interesting about this is that trading tricks people into thinking it's not a profession. It looks like you can just set up and do it because the barriers to entry are seemingly very low. I actually liken it like my 8-year-old is super into basketball. We live in the Bay Area, and there's this Steph Curry effect going around the country, right? Where like every kid is now shooting threes or trying to shoot threes and all that. And there's this, the game has obviously changed, and Steph Curry's been this big influence. And if you're in the Bay Area, the kids are all enamored of him and all that. And I think part of it is that if you look at somebody like LeBron or Jordan, it's probably pretty clear to kids that, these guys are gigantic guys that are freaks of nature, and they're doing these freakish things. And you look at Steph Curry and he looks pretty normal. So it lulls you into thinking that you can do what he's doing, or that it's somehow more achievable. And of course it's false, because what they can't see is that Steph Curry's probably, like, I don't know how many people on earth have ever walked around with that guy's eye-hand coordination. I mean, it's just so elite, but you can't see. Eye-hand coordination doesn't look like giant calf muscles. So you can't see it. And I think that trading, what's good with being good at trading, it's hard to see what goes into that, because it's hard to see how professional that industry looks from the outside. You think that people are just sitting there and they're looking at pictures and then hitting buy or sell, but there's so much that goes into it, and it tricks you into thinking that anybody can just do it. And you need to be professional in your approach. And the way to be professional in your approach, the thing that people, I repeatedly feel they don't get, is that it is not a single player affair. Trading is a team affair, and it requires communication and having people sanity check you and going back and forth and challenging one another. That's absolutely critical to learning to trade. And the cool thing is, it's never been more possible than it is today. There's forums, there's Discords, there's Slacks, there's Twitter, there's so much opportunity to form that team to work together. And that's why I really love what you're doing, because I'm pretty bearish on people deciding that this is something that's a good use of their time. I've been very open about that. I don't think it's a great use of most people's time. But for the people that have the itch and the true desire to do it, I can say that the only approach that is going to lead to success maybe there's some outlier out there, but for the most part, it's going to require forming a team around you, creating a culture of truth finding amongst that team, which means being humble, being able to criticize each other, being teachable, and not taking things personally, and trying and realizing that you're only going to go as far as you can together. So this is, and a lot of it is like, Matthew, honestly, like when you reached out to me, this is why I was inspired by what you're doing, is because you recognize this right away, and it probably comes very much from the military background, which is team oriented. But I think that as far as mentorship goes, it's recognizing that you need to be a team, you need to communicate, you need to learn from each other. It's not a single player game.
Absolutely. And what I'll tell you, like the most important thought process I ever had that kind of led to me being the thinker I am is when I was a young father. And at that point, I was married for 6 years, and I actually learned my identity and purpose as a man, right? And I know we want to say that men and women do different. I mean, men and women can do the same thing, and yes, they can. But however, when you're in a typical marriage between a man and a woman and you have children, I like to view it like this. Me as the man, I am supposed to lead, right? And that's just based off of my background. I'm always trying to lead people. So like I thought of it like this, around the same time I was getting into the market. And, I had this thought process as I held Lilia and she was a baby. And, I was a drill sergeant at the time. And so I'd get off at no kidding, 11 o'clock, and I'd be back up at 3 o'clock in the morning going to work. And I would, the 3 or 4 hours I was with my family, I would take care of my daughter to give my wife some, well-deserved sleep. And I thought, me as the man, it is my job to lead these two women, my baby girl and my wife, in this life. And I'm supposed to shield them from everything that I can shield them from. And it's up to my mentors, I shield them and I collect all these arrows in my back, right? From shielding them. And it's for me to rely on my team, my support team, to go through and pull the arrows out of my back for me so I can raise that family. Well, I think the same way with trading. I think the same way with anything I do in life. I'm transitioning to Bank of America in July. And I have no idea what I'm going to do there. I mean, I'm going into global technology. I don't know how the hierarchy is set up, but I do know this, they are a very team-based oriented organization from what I've researched and heard. And that was the driving factor for me going there. If somebody values, talent management, team building, not really having that typical hierarchy of chain of command, but having that hierarchy of what are you strong at? What are you weak at? How do you, view your team? How do you rely on them? Some of the key clues I got in the interview questions, which might have been just your generic ones. I don't know. It's been 20 something years since I've been to an interview, but that impressed me because up until Bank of America, I dropped 178 applications, got calls from 2 places and did interviews with them. And they were like, what do you bring to the table? How can you benefit our team? Well, they didn't say team. How can you benefit our company? Are you willing to work weekends? Are you willing to travel and be away from your family? And, that was just listen, I just spent the last 20 years selling my soul to the Army. I have to work because I want to work. But if I'm going to work, I want to be part of that team. And the same thing goes with, trading. When it comes to trading, we all have different thought processes. We all have different viewpoints. We all think completely different based off of our experiences in life. And, that's just the only way I know how to do this. And if I'm going to do it, I have to do it the way I think is the right way.
So I totally agree, man. Well, I think I think what you're doing and the team-oriented approach is the approach. It is the way.
Well, listen, if you ever, you're more than welcome to join our team. We don't have anybody truly from the profession to teach us, so we're just reading books and doing that. So if you ever want to join the team, you're more than welcome to. But at the end of the day, like, I really appreciate you doing this. I had to cut it short because my daughter's birthday party is about to kick off and we've hit the time limit. Hey, listen, Kris, I really appreciate you. And for the viewers out there, you know, like, you don't know them, you don't see them, you don't even know they exist. But however, I guarantee that there'll be one person, at least one, that listens to this and they would have pulled, and they might have been struggling with some of the stuff that we talked about, and they're going to be able to develop a plan around this. And that's what's important, right? Thank you for what you do, and thank you for being on here.
So it was a pleasure.